Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Mark Rye. I'm VP of Sales with Perram Corporation, and today we're going to be talking about metadata and how to put it to work. For those of you who are new to GoToMeeting, you'll see on the sidebar there is a questions panel. Feel free to enter any questions that you may have throughout the session into that panel, and I'll pop back from time to time and address those as we go through. Let's get started. So we're going to be talking about metadata as it applies to unstructured content, and as that unstructured content is managed in SharePoint or an enterprise content management system. So the goal is really to look at how do we go about defining what metadata we want to tag content with, and then what are some of the things we can do to prepare before actually tagging content. What are some of the things that we can go through to ensure that we have the logic required that's going to make that tagging as simple as possible. A lot of our clients right now are moving from the minimal use of SharePoint or an ECM system, which has maybe been in place for a number of years, and more heavy reliance on shared drives, into moving more of the legacy content forward into SharePoint or ECM. And as part of that, this metadata requirement has come up in terms of how are we going to tag this legacy content so that it's valuable and useful in the system. So when we talk about tagging unstructured content with metadata, what we're really doing is just looking at the attributes that we want to associate with those files. So anything as simple as the create date, modified date, the authors, a lot of that system metadata is available. But we want to branch out beyond that and start to think about things like location, facility, code, project name, specific business metadata elements that are specific to the business that we'll want to be able to use and to recall information in the system as time goes by. When we think about unstructured content metadata, we really need to start to think about this and versus or. So metadata allows us to view content in multiple contexts and think of locating content in terms of multiple users. So instead of creating a set folder structure that we're going to navigate and everyone in the organization needs to be familiar with, metadata gives us a lot of different options in terms of being able to make that content more easily surface to a wider range. So we need to stay on the and side of that and versus or, and think about what are all these facets by which someone might think of how to access this content. And when we fully apply metadata to the file, it really explains the relationship of that piece of content to the business. So that might be, we might take a single file and look at it. Let's say it's a vendor document in terms of a engineering build, and that might be considered an engineering document. Obviously it has value there, but it also might act as a record for finance or legal or tech records as things get turned over. So considering all of these facets, who's going to interact with the content is an important part when we're planning out how this metadata is to be defined and then applied. And then obviously another one is how long does that content need to be kept. So we tend to break off retention and disposition as its own beast, but really it's just a type of metadata that we want to be able to tag that content with. What we find at Perram is traditionally metadata has been underutilized in SharePoint and ECM implementations. And again, traditionally those systems are drawing very heavily on folder structures to organize content and for users to browse to content that they're interested in. As the repositories get larger, though, and as we move away from ECM really being kind of a departmental document management system to a true enterprise content management system, we find that there's this requirement to be able to provide better searching and browsing through to content across the organization. And beyond that, there's obviously a number of advanced features that are going to take place in ECM or SharePoint, which are going to be triggered off of your metadata elements. So things such as workflows that might be kicked off, or even your basic search can be improved through metadata tagging. The trend that we're seeing the last couple of years really is this move towards faceted search, or faceted browsing, or faceted navigation, depending on the terminology you want to use. And that really is where we're trading folder structures for metadata filters. And it's allowing the organization to present content in a manner in which people from various parts of the organization can quickly access content that they don't access on a regular basis. So they don't need to, if you're in HR, you don't need to know the finance folder structure to be able to access a document there. You can very quickly apply some filters to search results and get narrowed down to the information that you're looking for. And there's lots of examples of this faceted search. I'm just going to switch gears for a quick second and take a look at an example of what I mean. And like I said, there's examples all over. I'm on the Sears website in this case, and I'm just going to look up refrigerators. And you can see here, if we consider in this analogy our refrigerator to be a dock type, when I come in and I choose a type of refrigerator, I chose one with a French door, then it's telling me I have 149 search results. So without this faceted searching, if I simply did a full text search and it returned me with 149 results, that's going to be painful to be able to go through and find the actual file or the content that I'm interested in. But the application of metadata and using the facets allows me to say, well, I know I'm interested in a KitchenAid, that's a good brand, and I know that it has to fit in my opening in my kitchen. So a couple clicks and I'm down to a refrigerator that makes sense for me. So again, if we draw this analogy between what we're commonly seeing being used on the web for product searches, and we think doc type and we think metadata, now what we need to do is define our doc types, in this case again, refrigerator being a doc type, and then think about across the organization, if when we're thinking about browsing and filtering results, there's other types of metadata as well, but across the organization, what are the different elements or filters that someone might want to apply to that doc type or that search result to be able to get down to and refine the positive hits so that they can get to the content that they're interested in. And this model we see time and time again, both being used commonly in SharePoint, again, very similar to what we're seeing on public-facing websites such as this, being used in a SharePoint environment, being used in OpenText Content Server, has some faceted searching as well, some other ECM systems. So just an analogy to help us set the stage for what we're thinking about here. It's how do we use these filters to better improve our search results. And we're not selling refrigerators today, unfortunately. So how do we use that goal of better search, better faceted browsing to develop our metadata and then tag the content? So one of the things we've seen that works really well is a focus on doc type. So when we're talking about metadata, we might talk about a taxonomy, building out metadata lists. But what we've found works really well is know your doc types and then define those metadata elements required per doc type. So If it's a refrigerator, what are the elements that people are going to want to browse or select or filter to be able to refine those results? Okay, so know those elements, and then, if possible, define the controlled vocabulary for the metadata elements. We'll talk about the application of that in a minute. And then this, obviously, once we define these things, we need to be able to apply that both to legacy content and content moving forward. For most organizations we speak with, the challenge is they have tens of millions of files in the shared drive that need to be sorted, filtered, and tagged appropriately. So that's the context through which we're going to proceed with the rest of the presentation here. I really talked about document type as being the linchpin for that metadata model, because what it allows us to do is, if we can classify the document to a doc type, then we know specifically what metadata elements we're looking for, and we know what controlled vocabulary we need to apply for those elements. So it's a good logic model for being able to process metadata against a large body of content that might be sitting out there in the wild. Those metadata fields can be broken up into global fields. Obviously, you're going to have some that might cross all document types, such as, owner of the document, your retention information. You might want that on all documents. And then you're going to have your document or your doc type specific metadata types. So those are going to be things that support your processing, either automated or manual processing of those files over time. So what processes within your organization are those files used for, and what would be valuable to tag them in support of that process. And then what are the ways in which folks are going to want to search or browse to get to these files. And this is becoming really the underlying productivity enhancement with metadata, is this filtering that we're talking about. We found that there's really, from a processing point of view, there's really three main types of ways in which we can apply metadata to legacy content. And I want to run through those so that you can see from a perspective of actually applying metadata to content that might be in your shared drives, for example, right now. What are the things that you can start to think about to prepare for that, and what are those methods going to be in which metadata will be applied? And those break down into three main areas. One is the inherited metadata, one being the dependent metadata, and the last one being the extracted metadata. We're going to take a look at each one of those. Now, these are terms that Perram uses internally to define the means by which the metadata elements are being identified and tagged to a particular piece of content. So inheritance is just as it sounds. If we're in a scenario where, as I've referred to, we have this doc type defined, and the first step of this process is really to classify each file to a doc type. So if we have 10 million files and we have, let's say, 100 doc types, we're going to start to slot the files into the right doc type. That's kind of the first step of a typical process. And then as we find the files, their proper home and lined up against their proper doc type, then we know what we need to do metadata-wise, what elements beyond that we go to. But that, in a lot of cases, is the first step of the project, is to classify to doc type. As we do that, as we file things into that correct doc type, there are, in some cases, metadata elements that can be inherited. So in this case, we have the example on the screen as an as-built proposal. So we're talking obviously in terms of a major project construction. As-built proposal might tell us, once we know that something is that kind of doc type, it might be able to tell us what the document category is, for example. So that type of inheritance is something that we want to keep an eye out for when we're developing our doc types to say, okay, if we know it's this kind of doc type, then maybe we know it must be a drawing, or we know it must be a contract, and so make a listing of those inheritance values that could be auto-populated based on that initial classification. I'm just going to pop open the questions, make sure that there's nothing sitting there. We're good. Feel free to enter anything in if there's anything that comes to mind. I'll pop back again towards the end of the session. The next type of processing when we're looking at metadata is the dependent metadata. So dependent is very similar to inheritance in that we're looking at a relationship between two fields or two variables. But with dependency, it's just a little more complicated because there may be other things in the mix. So it's not as simple as a straight inheritance. If it goes here, it gets applied all of these fields. An example of dependency between metadata, for example, would be if we can identify the facility code associated with a particular document. That might tell us the city, the county, the state, the facility type, right? So it's a good exercise to go through once we've identified or once you've developed your metadata lists. So assuming you did go doc type and then metadata elements below that, see if there are dependencies that can feed off one off of another. And then it may require the development of a matrix outside of the metadata model that supports those dependencies, right? So we know that if we can identify facility code, we can auto-populate 4 or 5 values. A lot of, I think there's the impression out there that a lot of this metadata is done through extraction, and it's very high tech and it's very magical. But the reality is a lot of it's about relationships and understanding, designing from the ground up what you're trying to accomplish. And building out this logic needs to be built out. So if you can do it ahead of time as you're building out your metadata model, it will just simplify any of the execution of that model as you move forward. So you're essentially building the rules for the application at the same time as you're building out the model itself. The last type of processing that we might go through to apply content to or apply metadata to unstructured content is that of extracted metadata. So this is really the example where the field, the content is the key to providing the metadata element. And this isn't the case as often as you might think. So I think there may be the impression out there that all we need to do is turn the piece of software loose on the files, and it's going to go into the files and find everything we need and tag it. The reality is that we see is many metadata elements simply don't exist in the file. So while it's correct that the file would be tagged with, 5, 6, 7, 8 elements, those elements are nowhere to be found within the file contents, within the file naming, the file metadata properties from the system metadata. So that's why when I talk about these logic models that go on behind the scenes, it's important to start to think through those and put those in place, because a lot of this comes from that kind of investigation of the relationships between files and metadata elements themselves. When we talk about extraction, obviously there's automated extraction where, in this case, we can use a piece of software to go into the contents of the file and search for certain things. So in a case where we've defined our metadata model, we've defined our doc types, our metadata elements, and then below that we've defined the controlled vocabulary for those metadata elements. What we can do is load that controlled vocabulary. So in this case, facility location, we have 4, valid addresses. So when we see 123 East Street, Atlanta, we know that that is a positive hit on facility location, and we can pull that out and tag, right? So that controlled vocabulary is an important aspect as well. So it's not enough to simply say we want to tag with facility location. We need to be able to tie that to something. And in terms of an automated process, if we have that controlled vocabulary, that is a very accurate, for lack of a better term, very accurate process for the software to run, right? So we're telling it, look for this. When you see it, pull it out and apply it as facility location. Some other examples of that are things like character strings that are known, that are set, and don't change. So, you know, within your organization, if you have project naming conventions or you have product codes that are always existing, you know, letter, number, we can feed that into a piece of software and it'll go in, and where we find that string, it'll return it back as a positive hit on the product code. Same thing, phone number, SIN number, credit card. I mean, there's all sorts of applications of that kind of processing as well, where we're looking for patterns or strings within the content and then extracting that as metadata. Now, like I mentioned, that's only part of the story, and I think that's the story. I think that's the part that people want to believe is prevalent, and certainly it's important, plays a big role, but it certainly isn't the whole story. Metadata really is a lot more complicated than that. And occasionally we get to the point where manual extraction is the only option. Okay, so this might happen in cases where, you know, the quality of the documents is just poor and a software program is having a hard time making sense of them. Or it may exist where we're looking at, you know, a drawing, for example, you know, the file name's not telling us anything, the titling in the document is inconsistent, and someone literally is opening that document to determine what kind of drawing that is. And that actually happens. And it's a scenario that we've seen where there's real human expertise involved with defining how that document will be tagged. Now, that doesn't make sense to do for every doc type, obviously, but there are doc types and there are repositories that are of high enough value to an organization. And for one that we see is in major projects records turnover environment, where we have documentation about a project sitting together, and we've done all of the automated, we've done all of the logic models that we can, and then there's still some files that we don't know anything about them, and the software can't do much with them. And in some cases, it makes sense from a cost point of view to go in and put some human eyes on those and define what kind of document those actually are and how that document should be tagged. So the takeaway from that is really just that when we get into applying metadata to your legacy content, first of all, if you've dug into your file shares, your shared drives, your old SharePoint sites, you know there could be anything in there, right? So just analyzing and making sense of that content is an effort. And there's lots of exceptions that we're going to find. We can't make any assumptions in terms of that it's all good content, it's all final content, it's all. So what we find is this kind of processing for metadata. While automation is certainly a part of it, and it makes it provides the productivity or the throughput that makes it all happen, you really need eyes involved and the human mind involved to be able to process through the exceptions, because there's lots of exceptions out there, and you really need flexibility in the system and in the process that you're using to be able to determine when it makes sense to take various courses of action to be able to diagnose what kind of content we're looking at and how to apply metadata against it. So in summary, here are some thoughts, I guess, to wrap up. if you're thinking about applying metadata to legacy content, again, for this idea of migrating into SharePoint or an ECM system, think about your doc types. If you're able to define your doc types, then build out your metadata elements per doc type and define your controlled vocabulary. So that gives the solid starting point to say, okay, if we can classify the doc into the doc type, then we know exactly what we're dealing with. And then it gives us the ability to be able to make use of the best use of automated technologies to be able to go and pull values and apply them against that content. Also, some good things to do is think about the role of inheritance when you're looking at your doc types. So what elements can be automated in terms of their inheritance. Think about the logic model for dependencies. This is probably one that would require the most, it could require the most thought in working through, because some of these links aren't as obvious as you might think. So we spend on our projects, we'll spend time with our clients to help them explain what this logic might be, because quite often it's out there. There are dependencies that we can draw from that are going to make the tagging a lot easier, a lot more streamlined, but that logic needs to be built out. So put some thought to, how are different metadata elements that we're interested in tied together, and what source might be linking them. Maybe there's another system that already has some linkages between them that we could reference. Maybe there's something showing up in a file name that is going to feed off into some other values we're interested in. So there's a bit of detective work involved at that level. And once we figure that out, again, it makes everything much easier. The biggest takeaway is probably don't assume that technology is going to solve everything, right? So we can turn the software loose, any piece of software loose, it can analyze the documents, but the bottom line is a lot of the metadata fields that we see folks want to tag documents with, they don't exist in the documents. So that software is absolutely limited in what it can do. So we need to really focus on these dependencies and all these relationships that we're talking about, and be prepared that exceptions are going to be the norm. Think about processes and the personnel that you're going to have in place to be able to work through those exceptions and look for ways in which we can either come up with new logic or consider whether something's worth manually putting eyeballs on the content or not. So there's going to be pockets within each organization which are high value, extremely high value, and it may actually make sense to have eyeballs kind of study those files and determine where they fit, and there's going to be lots of areas where that doesn't make sense. So think about the value to the organization of the different content types, and where it might make sense to spend a bit more time, and where it makes sense to just do the best you can and move on. So we're coming up to our time. We were scheduled for 30 minutes. We're coming right up to 30 minutes. I'm going to pop into the questions panel and just see if there's anything there. I'm not seeing anything as of yet, but I'll hold on for a minute. If there is anything, feel free to enter it now, and we can address that. If you need to drop off now, I appreciate your time. Hopefully this gave you some things to think about. It's a big discussion, so if we didn't hit on things that you're interested in, feel free to get in touch, and we'd be glad to continue the discussion. All right, at this point, I'm still not seeing anything drop in to the questions panel. Oh, as soon as I say that, of course, there's one. And the question is, will the presentation be available? Yes, the presentation is being recorded, and as well I can make the slides available, so it will be there as a resource for you should you be interested. Yeah, I think that's all we have. So I'm going to thank everyone for their time. Hope you have a great day. And again, if you're interested in carrying on the conversation, just let me know.